The way that independent publishing works in Italy is that you find a publisher.
Okay,
that leads nicely into OSR, because I think that's one of the best things that's happening in Italy right now.
Is it a dinner and a game, maybe, or I'm just throwing random ideas? I don't know.
There's a convention called GnoccoCon.
Hello and welcome to Tabletop RPGs in Italy interview. I am Maciej from the Polish channel Dobre Rzuty. This is our English-speaking channel, and I have a guest with me.
Hello, cześć. Is that right?
Pretty good. That's pretty nice.
I'm Claudio. I've been playing RPGs in Italy since I'm in middle school or something like that. And although I've lived outside of Italy for like 5 or 6 years, I still keep in touch with the communities there. And I fly back and attend conventions. That's pretty sad if you think about it. But I guess But
you are experts. You are the expert on Italy today. So basically, if you say anything wrong, your Italian friends are gonna hate you for it. But no pressure.
I am speaking for the entirety of my country, and
and you know everything for sure.
I know everything about Italy, every single thing.
No, this is like. So if you say something wrong and some people will mention it, we can record another podcast, like more podcasts about tabletop RPGs. So this is part of the plan. So don't worry.
It's the content.
Yeah, more or less. So Italy, this is like the second episode of a series that we are learning about tabletop RPGs in other countries. So I personally like to start with context first. So a little bit of history of Italy and culture of Italy, but this is like before tabletop RPG. Before we get into tabletop RPGs, like try to help us to understand the Italian mindset and
prehistory.
Before
the written word.
Like go as far as you feel you need to go in order to understand the Italian perspective.
All right. Yeah, actually, Italy. I think you can a little bit empathize with this because Poland is also a big country with lots of different kind of cultures inside of it. But
less so nowadays, I think.
Less so nowadays, okay. But generally, you need to think of Italy as like maybe 3 or 4 countries in one. You need to understand that Italy is, as a country, it's 160 years old, 163, 65, I don't remember the exact number. And before that, we were a bunch of different city-states and different countries in the peninsula. Obviously, there was always the idea of all of these countries being Italian, but just because that's the Italian peninsula, right? So kind of a geographical idea of being together, but the idea that we are culturally together wasn't exactly... Not everybody was in agreement. Until Italy was unified. And still, not everybody was in agreement for another 50 years, maybe, until people got used to it. And still nowadays, there's a little bit of, I think we all speak different languages. People don't know this, but Italian is not the native language of every Italian citizen. But there's maybe 4 or 5 Italian languages. So they're not these are not dialects of Italian, even though the Italian government describes them as such. They are different languages that are derived separately from Latin.
Okay, I know Sicilian exists.
Yeah, there's Sicilian. I would guess that there's the Neapolitan group of languages, which is southeastern Italian, that they're all mutually intelligible with Neapolitan. So I won't call it Neapolitan because then the people from Apulia get angry. Then there's the central dialects, which are actually dialects of Italian. So what is spoken in Rome and Florence and Marche. Then there's the what is called the Gallo-Italic, so the ones that are closer to French, which is in the northwest. And then there's Venetian, which is its own group. And I'm grossly painting out a lot of different linguistic minorities. But what I'm saying is that before the advent of television and of common schooling, these were the native languages of the people of Italy. And in fact, back in the Renaissance, Venetian was a lot more respected than it is today. For example, like it was spoken by merchants all over the Mediterranean.
It makes sense, yeah.
The current Italian is derived from the Florentine dialect, so from Florence, and it was chosen because that's what Dante wrote his poems in. That's it. Like Dante is very respected, so they chose that as the common language. When Dante was writing the Divine Comedy, he wasn't thinking, "Oh, I'm writing in Italian." The Italian wasn't a language. He was writing in Florentine, so the concept of an Italian language, common language, is very new, and it was adopted as common language by the unified Italy. Before then, actually, I think certain, depending on the different country that you were in Italy, they would use either Latin as a legal language. Some countries used French. Some countries used Spanish because they had Spanish. They were owned by, they were conquered or owned by Spanish monarchs. I think Naples used actually Neapolitan. So there's Venetian. Venice definitely used Venetian, but there was a diversity also in the kind of high register language. So the one you would use for business and legal stuff. And,
I see. Okay.
Yeah, the idea of having a common language is very new. So I also can only speak for the north because I come from Lombardy, which is in the region of Milan, for whoever doesn't know. So I can't really speak for the south or the center of Italy. They're very different places. Even though we are connected, they're also different places. So if you think about it, there's less distance from Milan to Frankfurt than from Milan to Rome.
Okay. Okay. So I think the broad understanding we have in Poland is that the north of Italy is different from the south. This is like the basic understanding. With the north, I believe, is thought of as being usually more rich, colder, obviously. South, more poor, and I still feel like more. I think more stereotypical Italian would be more south, like
that's
more
because
expressive, more just basically.
That's because the majority of immigration comes from there. So then the stereotype that other countries have of us, because of the people that moved abroad, especially to the US, is mostly people from the South. This I'm saying completely neutrally, like I'm not passing any judgment or anything. I'm just saying that's what happened historically. Yeah. And I would say that's mostly right. I'm not going to get into the reasons of the poverty of the South because it's very complicated and everybody has a different opinion on it. And then I'm going to say something controversial, and I'm not sure. I'm not even sure that I'm informed to speak about it.
Yeah, but all countries have richer and poorer regions. This is it's what happens. Yeah, for a lot of reasons. Yeah,
but yeah, in general, the South is more poor. And they have the best food, for sure. Like Naples has by far the best food in all of Italy.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think this is uncontroversial to say, even for the Northerners, that Naples has the best food.
Yeah, I think I've heard about Neapolitan pizza.
Yeah.
First and foremost, like this is the place you go to learn about pizza.
Yeah.
Okay. I see. So I think okay, maybe let's a couple more historical questions. So this is jumping more way back, but do you consider yourself Romans? So, like Romans, were the Romans you guys, or was it a different culture that you inherited from?
Do you want to know what I think or what the average Italian thinks?
Both.
I think not. I think the majority of Italians would say they agree somewhat. I think. Especially people from the center, especially people from Rome. I think, though, from another perspective, we are the closest thing that is left to the ancient Romans. But I don't see this as the same culture. Too much time has passed. That said, we are in continuation of that. So it's difficult to say when you are the same, and we've definitely been charged with the preservation of that legacy, and especially the preservation of those great artistic let's say architectural landmarks.
Mhm.
I think the average Italian might look at the past a little bit too much and feel very satisfied with what his ancestors have done.
Okay.
And that's, in my opinion, one of the reasons that a lot of Italians don't feel that they have to like build anything.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a strong statement, but I think that it's true from like having lived outside of Italy for a long time. Like if you now I live in Finland, and if you see the Finnish, they don't have like a very long and rich history as we do, and they feel that they need to build stuff. You know, they really have this drive in them that they need to make the country work.
Yeah, but okay, so I live in Krakow, which is a pretty culturally rich Polish city with a lot of medieval churches, beautiful art and whatnot. But I was in Venice for a week. Like, you can get tired of beautiful paintings and sculptures. It's, you walk down the street and there's some random church just in the back alley, and you enter it and there's like master class paintings of Renaissance art, and you're just, I don't know. I've seen 100 today. I have no more room for appreciating art. It's crazy. The amount of buildings and like the art that's created is just crazy. And yeah, now that I think of it, it's interesting. Yeah, you had like on the Italian peninsula, you had the Roman Empire at its height with all the glory and richness and culture and whatnot. And then there was Italian Renaissance, which you could argue is another peak of creation of art and whatnot. So
yeah, well, and Renaissance was born out of the reappreciation of classic works, and I have to say some of it due to the preservation of these works by Christian monks, and some of them, maybe most of it, from actually the re-importing of these works from Arab sources, which in the Middle Ages were the
especially the literary sources, I think. Yeah.
Yes, in the Middle Ages, like Middle East was the fucking shit. Like they were the center of kind of, I don't want to say science because the scientific method wasn't invented, but maybe like knowledge or whatever. So they preserved a lot of texts that then came back to us.
Yeah.
That is so it's definitely a rediscovery of those ideas, those same ideas that were being explored by the ancient Romans. It's really difficult to. I think you will need a historian to get into the details of like what this means and like why it happened, and why Italy. I think there's a geographic reason that it's generally a rich land from the point of view of both agriculture, like of what it can give you by farming it or by grazing animals on it. And also it's in a strategic location in the Mediterranean. So like it was the center of a lot of trade and exchange and whatever. Might not be the case anymore.
Yeah, yeah. In medieval ages or Renaissance, if you want to be the maritime power in the Mediterranean, the Italian peninsula is the place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like Rome first, and then and Romans weren't amazing sailors, but they still did it. And Venice later, yeah, for sure. Okay, I can also mention that when a Christian monk told me that Italy is the perfect country because like it has everything. It has mountains, it has beaches, it has history, it has culture. It's just the best place ever.
If only it had a good work culture, I would go back live there. But
interesting. Okay, so so we have a context now. Let's like place one foot towards the tabletop RPGs, which is fiction in Italy. Do you have is there some noticeable like trends, like what types of fiction Italians like, what types of fiction Italy creates? What can you tell the Italian work of fiction from like others just by reading it, just by the content?
I don't know. Like I think historically, for sure. Like if you look at the literature, for example, I'm thinking of fantastical specifically, but the literature from Ariosto or Boiardo, all the kind of these people that were talking about the paladins of Charlemagne. There's a lot of tradition of like a specific type of fantasy literature that is, I would say, specific to Italy and maybe a little bit of France. But if you look at modern concept of fantasy, that stuff has been almost completely erased by reinterpretations of kind of this American or British fantasy tropes. So I actually don't know if there's anything that I would say is specifically very Italian in fantasy fiction. If you look more at, I guess I might not be the best person to ask this. So I might keep it short just to avoid saying things that I don't know too much about. But my impression is that recently we've been either we've colonized ourselves or we've let Anglo-American culture colonize us to the point that
always the Yankees.
I somewhat think this is mostly self-inflicted. And it might be, again, this is completely speaking out of my ass. It's a bit of a guess, but it might be because of the influence of American culture post-World War II, with all the Americans were like, they left their stuff over the peninsula as they came to liberate it or conquer it or whatever, or drive the fascists out. And I think that left a very big impression on the Italian people. And American culture has always been very influential. That said, I think one of the things that left an impression back was the age of Italian cinema, like when Italian cinema was like the shit. I think back in, I don't want to mischaracterize the period because I didn't live through it, so I have secondhand information over it. But
sure,
especially when you think about like the spaghetti westerns, but those are definitely not the only films that were made in that period. Those are the ones that stick to me because I really like them. Ennio Morricone, Sergio Leone, and all that stuff. Like I think there was a period in general of Italian cinema that kind of hit back, kind of influenced the Americans back. So it's definitely not a one-way street, but definitely in the last 20 years, I can't see anything that we successfully exported. And also, I think Italian culture is at the same time right now very, again, I'm saying this, I don't want to minimize actual colonization, but I do think it's somewhat colonized by American culture. And also whatever we produce...
You could argue both ways. I mean, wasn't New York colonized by Italians in many ways?
Yeah, to an extent, yeah. But we also, whatever we produce is mostly aimed at an Italian audience, so it's very self-referential. I've tried to speak about this to many people that like people that do publishing in Italy, people that do tech, people that do almost everything that is produced is aimed at an Italian audience. And even when they translate it, it doesn't like successfully get out of Italy, or not even vaguely in the numbers that the people that make it want it to be. And that's also because the idea of making something for the international market is always framed in the confirmation that this gives you to the rest of the Italians as like, oh, look at me, I export in the international market, and not really as and they're not really looking for actual numbers or actual confirmation from an actual international audience, right? So it's something that makes you higher status because you're making products in English or products in French, but then the actual ones that get successfully exported, most of the time it happens either by chance or because they get noticed by somebody outside, and not because they're actively pushed. So we are very, very bad right now, I think, at, and these are all my opinions, by the way. I just want to make that clear.
Sure, okay.
But we're very, very bad at exporting almost anything cultural right now, except for food.
Which is something. Like the world noticed. Yeah, okay, makes so it's like it seems to me like from what you're saying, again, your opinion, but that maybe it goes back even to the heritage of Rome and like Renaissance Italy, like that you have your stuff is so good that the world should be interested in it.
Yes.
Rather like that you shouldn't think about like the world for like, it's Italy first in this like
Yes.
good like pride sense of like our stuff is just so good. So
Yeah, but then there's no because of that there's no push or no strong push to like actually try to get on with the times or try to actively market our things to an international audience. So
that's what we have Americans for. So
yeah.
Yeah,
I think Italy has a lot of potential. That's why I'm speaking of it in these terms.
Okay.
It's a bit of frustration with it because I think if we just changed our mentality a little bit, and we could be really strong culturally in Europe and internationally, even further abroad.
I see.
And it wouldn't even need a massive reinvention of our culture. It would just need a little bit of a different perspective.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's really difficult because people don't feel they need to do this.
I see. Yeah. So I think like comparing to Polish, maybe like to Poland, you don't have your Witcher 3, which is our Polish stuff is great. Let's put it into a game and give it to the world. Like let the world learn about our stuff because it's so good. Okay. Yeah.
Actually, comparison with Poland is probably I strongly believe that in 20 years Poland is going to be a richer country than Italy. If the current trends are not changed, I am definitely in this camp because if you see how tech is evolving in Poland, it's almost the opposite of what's happening in Italy. It's uncanny.
Okay, interesting.
I think the Poles, again, external perspective, but I think the Poles have this push of like, since they joined the European Union and they had a little bit of an economic boom, they have this push of like, let's get our stuff like out there. And it's almost the opposite of what's happening to Italy. Italy is running on fumes on all of the prestige of things that people that are alive now haven't done.
Okay, like it's okay. We're getting into a different discussion, so like I'm gonna.
Yeah, sorry.
It's an interesting discussion. So, but I'm gonna stop myself because let's go back to tabletop RPGs.
Yeah.
Although, like, I don't know. Let's see what the comment section says about this. And
I'm sure I've offended some Poles, so they're gonna tell me I'm a moron.
Look, it's the internet. You probably offended some Italians. You probably offended some Poles. It's the internet. So no worries. Okay, but this is okay. This gives us a perspective on RPGs. So like, is it? Because I don't know many tabletop RPGs that came from Italy. I think I can name two, maybe. Like, I don't know if you consider The One Ring by Francesco Nepitello.
Yeah.
Do you consider this like an Italian game? Because it doesn't seem Italian because it's it's Lord of the Rings, but
I would say it's made by an Italian, definitely. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what qualifies as an Italian game. I also think it's based in the very strong Tolkienist, let's say, analysis. And like, there's a lot of people in Italy that appreciate Tolkien a lot.
For sure, like, it's not The Witcher, which is made by Poles and also Polish in its essence in some way. Like,
yes,
it's The One Ring. It's Lord of the Rings. So
so it's definitely a reinterpretation of something, but you could call that an Italian RPG, and I wouldn't disagree with that.
Made by Italians, for sure.
Yeah, I can quote like probably one of the most popular that's been produced is called Sine Requie, which means like without rest in Latin, and it's sort of a zombie apocalypse game. And it's set in this distorted version of Europe. And with, especially if you play in Italy, there's a strong presence of the Catholic Church and how they've interpreted this zombie apocalypse as sort of a message from God. So it's got an interesting setting. I don't necessarily think the mechanics are all that great. They're not super bad, but they're just not particularly innovative. But that game is very, very popular, and the authors of it have made several games. But I don't know if these have ever been exported outside of Italy. I think they would be very difficult to translate because the cultural references inside of it. Actually, I think Sine Requiem might work in Poland because of the references to the Catholic Church. But
as I mentioned before the podcast, I believe that Poles are basically introverted Italians.
Yeah, I think it might work in Poland, but not anywhere else. Or maybe that game needs a strong Catholic context to actually understand the satire behind it.
I'm thinking about France and Spain, but
maybe
Portugal. But I think it's different. Like the role the Catholic Church plays.
Yeah.
So maybe Ireland.
Maybe Ireland. That's it. Yeah, like the role that the Catholic Church has in society, I think, is very similar, compatible in Italy and Poland.
Yeah, because I think like France, like a Catholic Church seems to be more like upper class thing.
Yeah,
and in Poland, I'm not like everybody thing.
I'm not exactly knowledgeable enough about France to speak on that.
Yeah, I know like a little bit. So let's wait for tabletop RPGs in France for that.
But what I have been to Poland several times and I have some Polish friends, and my understanding is that some of the satire and frustrations also the good things as well. But I don't want to necessarily offend people that like the Catholic Church, but the strong presence of the church in the country has caused some very similar cultural expressions, both of agreement and of disagreement.
I feel like the default family is Catholic. Both in your mom is Catholic, maybe your grandma is Catholic first and foremost. Yeah, Catholicism runs deep in the country, like culturally.
Yeah, and there's I'll let you get to tabletop RPGs, I swear. But there's a TV series called Don Matteo, and it's been translated to.
It's called Don Matteo in Italian.
Yes.
Holy fuck!
How do you pronounce it? Ojciec Mateusz. Ojciec Mateusz. Ojciec Mateusz, and it's the exact same name. Yeah, it's the exact same thing.
I thought like they changed the name or something from the original. No, it's the same name.
It's the same exact thing. He rides the same fucking bike. And that, I think, is an expression of this type of culture. Like the idea
that you can translate it so literally, and like Polish people are like, yeah, fair enough, like makes sense. It's like 100% Polish.
I think the idea in that series is that the priest detective always solves the case, but he never ever beats the police at it, right? He always arrives 5 minutes before the police get to it because he doesn't want to he also feeds information back to them. And then his objective is not to catch the criminal, but to make the criminal repent.
Yeah.
And to make the criminal ask for forgiveness from God. I think that's like just such a perfect description of the mentality. And I say it in a completely neutral way. Like, I don't want to make people think that I'm making fun of it. I actually think there's something to appreciate in this. And there's also something maybe to criticize, but it's a description of the Catholic mentality for sure.
Yeah, my friend from the channel was considering making basically an adaptation of Brindlewood Bay.
Yeah.
To Ojciec Mateusz. Like,
yeah, holy shit. Oh, we should collaborate on that. Holy fuck.
Yeah, the formula would work. Like, it's like the cozy detective horror story with like a small town that has inexplicably large amount of violent crimes. Okay. So tabletop RPGs. Let's go a little bit back in history. So, like, how did the tabletop RPG started in Italy?
Okay, so first of all, I wasn't alive, but obviously people talk a lot about this, so I have an idea. So I think the first tabletop RPGs were actually Italian-made because somebody heard of this from the US, but they didn't really have an idea of what it was. So they made, like, I think Catacumbas is one of the earliest. I have never played it. There was also another one, I forget the name.
Sounds like a dungeon crawling game, I would guess.
Yes, it literally means catacombs in like some old version of Italian or Etruscan or something like that. I'm not exactly sure where the name comes from, but It sounds like a dungeon crawling game, but I think it really became popular with the arrival of the Dungeons and Dragons Red Box, and specifically the 1983 version, which I believed arrived around 1985 or 1986 translated. So we're talking about the Menser box, the very famous one with a dragon on it, and the guy with a really weird pose with a shield that looks like he's out of some comic book. And the very popular Menser box, the so-called BX, never came to Italy until literally recently. So I think that's an interesting thing that we might want to get back on, or like what that caused. But I think the Dungeons and Dragons Red Box probably was the moment that the RPGs exploded. And so for a long time, I think the RPGs were either D&D or imitations of D&D, and specifically of that Red Box. AD&D First Edition also was never translated, but then AD&D Second Edition was translated, and it was actually marketed in Italy as the second edition of the Red Box, which it's not. So the people ended up moving from this basic expert Menser Red Box to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition, and I think when we start getting into alignment with the rest of the international community, is when the 90s stuff start happening, like all the vampire stuff and the edgy games. I think that kind of hit Italy almost at the same time as everybody else. I don't want to speak. I think Eastern European states, you've had your own development, because this stuff came a lot later, if I understand correctly, because of the Iron Curtain. Yeah. Because of the Iron Curtain. So I don't want to speak necessarily for you guys, but I think with the rest of the Western
long
world,
story short, like this stuff was building up in the West, and like after 88, 89, like the floodgates were open, and we were catching up with the mixture of everything. So
yeah, and I think also that might be a reason that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is so popular in Poland, but in other Eastern European countries.
More or less, but basically we got on the tabletop RPGs bandwagon like 94, 93, 95, when the stuff was starting to come here after the Iron Curtain was lifted. So yeah,
but let's exclude the Eastern Europe from the what I'm saying.
Yeah, you have this. Yeah, so you have this. The 90s are the like traditional years, like of traditional systems. With I'm assuming this was also with a cultural this idea of playing of the plot being more important, of role playing characters being more important. Less dice, more role playing discussions.
Yeah, like I think it was born out of this frustration with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition, because if you want to get this is I'm going to say a thing. This is historically like proven. These are facts. I genuinely don't care if people find it controversial, but AD&D Second Edition is one of the least playtested role-playing games of all time. In fact, it was 0% playtested by direction of the current owners, which were the ones that pushed Gary Gygax out. So I think it's very uncontroversial to say that it's a completely unplaytested game. If people liked it, that's fine. They probably made it work. I think whatever was good in it was left over from previous Dungeons and Dragons editions. But in any case, in that period, there was this push from TSR of like trying to turn D&D into a brand, which was also maybe pushed by certain cultural, economic conditions of the US. The liberalization of publishing and other stuff like this. And there was the idea of like selling these very long adventure paths, and Dragonlance was a big element of that, right? And I think the 90s explosion of these edgy games with at least promises of better role-playing, like Vampire and stuff, was born out of frustration with AD&D Second Edition, and this kind of contrast between what the actual rules were doing, which were still a derivation of some dungeon crawling rules, and what it was purporting to give you, which was like this epic fantasy adventure where you're some sort of fantasy superhero and save the land.
I'm starting to believe that like AD&D as a single product or product line, because there was like additions, like it shaped the RPG culture so much. Like so much of the late 90s seems to be a reaction to frustration with AD&D.
Second edition specifically, because the first edition was mostly just original D&D with some extra rules.
Yeah, and still the second edition is the one that's used as an engine for like Baldur's Gate games and Icewind Dale games, right?
Yeah, but I think when they get translated into video games...
No, I agree, but like it's interesting that a product that was so controversial and like one medium is in some ways does so well in video games. And like is known because of that.
Yeah, I work in video games, and I can say that the let's say the idiosyncratic elements of AD&D and Baldur's Gate are not looked at with positive eye from the inside of the industry, right? So
yeah, I'm a video game designer myself, and I also like replayed Baldur's Gate recently. Yeah, I wouldn't exactly praise it for the mechanics.
Think the strength of the game is in the writing, and not in the mechanics.
Oh yeah, very much. Yeah. The mechanics are, and they were replaced by video games.
Yeah,
like the people don't go back into making AD&D RPGs video game.
Yeah, exactly. They want to remake Baldur's Gate, but they always pick some different rule, or they change the system completely, right? So I think that there's a very good reason for that. But anyways, like again, I don't want to necessarily shit on AD&D, but and also within AD&D there were a lot of good things that came out, like a lot of campaign settings, also within the limitations that were imposed by TSR, managed to flourish some very good idea. I'm thinking of Dark Sun, I'm thinking of Spelljammer, I'm thinking of, I can't remember for the life of me, the Arabian setting or the Oriental setting. There were a lot of cool ideas that came out in those years. Some would argue maybe within the limitations imposed by TSR, because there was this kind of idea to try to avoid the satanic panic, so they had a lot of content restrictions. Maybe creativity flourished under that. I'm not sure exactly why it happened. But anyways, we got hit by the wave of 90s games. And I think it hit us very similarly to how it hit the US and other countries. So we definitely have our vampire era. And vampire is still very popular, although I would say in a healthier way than it was at the time. But the idea was that, okay, like we have a guy that writes a plot, and now we have the guarantee of a good story, right? This type of idea of role playing that right now I would say, fortunately, is a little bit it's on the it's less popular now. I would say that was maybe a growing pain that a role playing community needed to go through. So I don't necessarily look back at it with contempt.
It might have been like the medium discovering itself.
Yes, the medium discovering itself, maybe. But definitely there was this idea of okay, we can't get this really good plot thing from the system, so we're going to have a single guy like write it in advance, and then he's going to somehow make it work. We're going to give him all the power, and then he's going to make it. He's going to make it work somehow. Please don't tell us how you did it.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it was similar in Italy. In Poland, it happened later, but it goes like so. So the video games, could have like contributed to the factor, because the huge plots with huge stories with twists and turns and all the epicness, they worked in the video games.
Yeah.
So they should be able to work at the tabletop game, right? I think that was the impression that was also fueling the drive to game master, do the story, you're the guy, basically do Baldur's Gate on your tabletop game, except better.
Yeah, I think also it's a bit of a naive view on story, because I think what a lot of people, even in writing circles, like almost all of the writers that I respect, when they talk about writing, they don't necessarily bring up all these like structural elements. And I you have to plan out an arc for this character or stuff like this. I actually own the hero of the journey, the hero with 1,000 faces by Campbell. And I think one of the things that is very misunderstood about that book and the idea of the hero's journey, which is also what is based, what most of these techniques like the Harmon story circle and other stuff like this are based on, is that book is not prescriptive. It's not telling you how to write a story. It's making a comment on the fact that stories tend to be a certain way because of human psychology, specifically Jungian human psychology. And if you look at most of the writers that I respect, they tend to speak of their writing process almost as if they're playing a role-playing game. Like, oh, the character wanted to go there, so I don't know where these characters are going to go, right? They might have a vague idea, but then the character decides by themselves almost where to go. And then somehow you look at it from the end and you're like, oh, wow, I made like a story circle. I didn't even understand that I was doing it.
Yeah, this is a topic very close to my heart. I found I started to run tabletop RPGs using like having knowledge of story structures. I personally found that it works like both ways. So like doing the characters, like doing the simulation, right? Basically, makes characters live on their own, especially if they're well constructed. Me as a game master / writer I will tend to feel what the character needs to do, or like when I'm playing my characters, like when I'm a player. Yeah, I feel what the character would do, but also know adhering to the structure at some points also starts to give a feeling of what the character needs to do.
Yeah.
And it's not like a writer's like they need to do it because structure, but you just feel this is right. Like the story asks for it.
Yeah.
Maybe not like for specific action, but for a type of action.
Yeah. And it's so I generally agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying it's easy to get trapped into genre by also thinking like that, but I'm not. I don't think this is what you intend.
Let's blame Americans, because why not?
Yeah, let's always blame Americans. That's what we do here in Europe. It's always their fault.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Hollywood. So I don't know if Hollywood is at fault for this, but Hollywood has distilled the story structure to a precise science in a way. And again, I'm not saying they're correct. Like the model is correct, but I mean, it has its advantages. So they would even be, at page 17 of your script, the character needs to have this. Yeah, I think this is where in the commercial market, the story is created into this formula you should apply. Yeah, like do this and you will get story. And again, like when tabletop RPGs wrestle with story, like this is already has been distilled down to a formula in other media. So yeah, this might be the part of it.
But going back to the history of RPGs in Italy, I think then we got D&D 3rd edition, and at that point, we are in line with almost everything else that is happening, at least in the Western sphere. And I think that's also the point where we start being synchronized more or less with the Anglosphere, with the Anglo-American world. I think it's very important to understand that we never got certain games that, in my opinion, were developmentally important for the American scene. And these are, well, first of all, BX D&D, so the the Moldvay Dungeons and Dragons, the 1981 edition, and in general, any edition of original D&D that came out before the Satanic Panic was in place as a constraint on content by TSR. So already the 1983 version, which is the very popular red box, was cleaned up, and lots of violent elements and implications of violence, and especially demons and other types of magic, weird magic, were removed. I think the 1981 text is a very, very good text that breaks the kind of this narrative that role-playing games have been getting better and better over the years, that a lot of people like to portray. Because if you read that, you realize that it's describing it's not just a table of rules for combat, but it's describing very properly game procedures at the table, what the people at the table need to do. And it was in fact meant as a developmental text for beginners to get into D&D, which is the original games didn't do. So Menser really deserves credit for writing that, because that's very lucid. I think there's very little that I find non-functional in that game. And then there are other games that were kind of popular elsewhere but never got spread in Italy, are RuneQuest, Champions, Tunnels and Trolls. I think these were I maybe I will stand corrected, but I don't think these were ever translated. I think Traveler also. So these games all have had very different ways of being functional because they were not developed as a direct offshoot of D&D, but they were all developed like in the late 70s or early 80s, where back when D&D was still difficult to obtain. And so they were developed kind of in the individual ideas that these people had of what role-playing was. And so I think we missed all of that. We just missed all of that. And we didn't even get the best version of D&D. So
I have a theory
developmentally, I think this hurt the Italian role-playing ability to effectively role-play, I think, in the long term.
Well, I think that may be arguable. So I think maybe it's a theory. Maybe a similar process has happened in Italy and Poland. So also because we got on the Poland got into tabletop RPGs in like mid-90s, and so we also skipped some parts of the process. We got into the 90s with AD&D and the successor games came in, and the philosophy, AD&D might have not been played, but I feel like the philosophy that was entrenched in AD&D was very well, and like it was also present in World of Darkness games and also present in Warhammer. You would play those games with similar mindsets, and I feel like those mindsets in many ways assumed that you know how to play role-playing games, that you have, like, because people who wrote those games had experience with a previous generation of games.
Yeah.
And it's almost like assumed knowledge in those games, but it's not explained.
Yeah.
So again, if you skip the first step, it's different. You play differently. You don't know the procedures for some stuff. You don't know, for example, like in Poland, dungeon crawling wasn't really known in Poland, I wouldn't say.
Yeah.
And for Americans who would be playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, most of them would know dungeon crawling procedures from previous games and would use them, even though the new text doesn't describe them.
Yes.
So I think it might be somewhat similar in Italy. From what you're saying.
I think so. I've never played RPGs with Polish people, so I can't judge on what you're saying. I will say that, and again, I don't mean any offense to my fellow Italians. I'm just talking about averages. But I have played role-playing games throughout Western Europe, and I think Italians are, on average, the worst role players from the different types of countries that I've played role-playing games in. And I think that this lack of key developmental texts is a reason for it. And there's several other reasons. But if I get a game in a random gaming bar, or whatever you call them in that country, like sometimes they're called gaming cafes, sometimes they're called like game houses, whatever, like these types of local game stores or game hangouts. And if I get a random person playing my game and I want to run a one-shot, or like I'm just going to try not to filter as much as possible and just grab any random guy, then even though Finland here has maybe less amount of people and not as developed communities, the average player is going to be better, in my opinion. And I don't know the reason why, because I don't know the history of role-playing in Finland, but it's just a fact that I've come to accept as part of my experience. If I run a game in Italy and I get randoms, then it's going to be a crapshoot. Some of them are going to be good, some of them are going to be terrible. And again, maybe for no fault of their own, they were just taught bad habits by other people, and this is just what they know. Again, I don't mean to insult people necessarily, but the average ease with which I can find like skilled players is a lot better here.
Okay, but I will have to ask you to define what a good role-playing player is.
Yeah, I'm talking about proactiveness. I'm talking about proactiveness. Like proactiveness and the idea of like you are here and participating with me. You're playing this game with me. I'm not delivering something to you, right? Okay. This idea of transitive play, so that I'm that I am contributing, like I'm game mastering a game. I'm contributing some parts, but you need to do your job and contribute the other parts, right? So if you're used to this very directed style of play, where you're just essentially waiting for your turn to say your thing, and then the game master is going to make the story go forward, then you literally don't do anything. Like, you don't do your job as a player. As a player, you need to, put your character in the situation, tell me like what they're doing, why they're doing it, insert yourself in the correct moment, like kind of play off of what I'm saying. I'm playing off of what you're saying. We're kind of bouncing off each other. This kind of like very functional feel of fun that happens when people are just playing together. And so this is what I'm describing as good play. I know some people don't necessarily agree with me, but this is what I perceive.
Yeah, I just wanted to
be
precise, because like good role playing is a very broad term. So
yeah, sure.
Okay, so mostly you mean proactivity.
Yes, proactivity and respect of each other's jobs. So no one is trying to do another person's job or override what they're saying, right? So I'm doing my thing, you're doing your thing. I have my purview. I don't know if I don't know how to translate that word in Polish. I hope you know what it means, but I don't have a better one in English. Essentially, that as a GM, I manage certain things. And as a player, you manage certain things, and the interaction between these different authorities, which it doesn't mean authority over the people at the table. It means over certain things that I'm doing. Responsibility, authorship over these certain things. The interaction of these things creates unexpectedness and fun. If you are there and you're waiting for me to tell you what to do or to hint at you what you need to do, then this doesn't happen. And for me, the play is not fun. I become some sort of bard or storyteller, and I need to entertain you. And this, on the long run, I feel is what makes a lot of GMs burn out, because they don't have fun. They're just making other people have fun. So this is not what I'm looking for in role-playing. I understand some people think this is the best thing ever, so I don't necessarily want to tell them that they can't do it.
Yeah. So a couple of interesting things, okay, maybe two, is it seems to run contrary to the stereotype most people have about Italians, like that Italians are more extroverted. So what you described seems very like, introverted, that like, I don't know, the default mode of play for introverted people, just to, wait till some other person tells you what to do or asks for your input.
Okay, so, like they might do it chaotically and extrovertedly, but still like not successfully play with each other, just on each other, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So the average,
they will talk a lot during the game, but not necessarily contribute a lot in terms of initiative.
I think that the typical stereotype is of Italian players that they really want to act their character. And that's not necessarily a thing that I consider bad, but that's what they are there to do mainly, right? So they're not there to play a game, but just they have this kind of character in mind, and they want to do the voice and do the thespianism of it, right? They want to interpret it. We literally have a word for that. So that's not necessarily bad, but then when that's everything you bring to the game, then I personally, this is not what I'm interested in. I think it can be something that you can do that brings value to play, but you need to be playing in order to do it properly. And instead, I think a lot of people, we also have this dubbing culture that I also know doesn't exist in Poland. So we dub films, and the dubbers do these voices that are very unnatural. And a lot of players feel that those are the voices that they need to do when they're role playing. So they're going to do these very, very fake voices that are from dubbing of American movies, and they think this is what like a fantasy character sounds like.
So like everything is over the top, right?
Yeah. And so they really want to monologue, and they're just waiting for, okay, when is it my chance to monologue? I want to do my little thing, and then they're not really interacting with everybody else, right? So this is my impression, at least. Like I know for some people this is the height of all there is, but it's not what I am personally interested in. And so I find the thing a little frustrating. So it might even be like very chaotic and very like people maybe talking over each other because that's what Italians do, but they're not necessarily like interacting according to the game, right? So they're just kind of, hey, can I do my thing? Or hey, can I do my thing?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting on many levels. Okay, hugely because I think similar things happens in Poland. It's very similar. Okay, there's nuances that are important, but it seems similar, partly because of the, I don't know, I call it the rockstar and the concert model, or the performer and the audience. So the game master is the performer, and the audience is there to participate, but usually, on just by the cues of a performer. So they're not asked for initiative. Like, just when the performer asks for initiative, they would respond, but otherwise they're an audience. And in Poland, for sure, there also used to be, still is to a degree, the audience is also there to rate the performer.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's this idea, how good of a game master are you? How you know.
That's definitely 100% the mainstream culture in Italy. There are some subgroups and some communities that don't do this. I don't want to paint a wide brush. Whenever I'm talking generally, I'm talking generally. So this means that I'm not describing individuals, but averages. So I'm not necessarily saying that everybody is like this. I'm just saying that there's a trend.
Yeah, so I think that maybe the roots are similar. If I would have to point like one major feature that maybe influenced this culture is, again, the traditional games of the 90s. And by traditional, I mean the like trad culture, so the culture focused on telling the story.
Yeah,
mostly the like strong game master who is responsible for the story. So because there's this promise that there's going to be a great story and that the game master is the one to deliver it, like obviously the game masters hype themselves up on expectations, like I'm going to write the best, I'm going to tell the best story ever.
Yeah.
And the players are like, the game masters is going to tell, like, he thinks he's going to tell the best story ever, so I'm here to witness and to evaluate.
Yeah.
But then there's the question of, what's the player's role in this? And I would argue that in Poland we have this, especially like late 90s, early 2000s. I would say this was the not really the pinnacle. This was like late traditional culture that already has. I think that there was a understanding that wasn't really voiced because it was weird to say it out loud. But what's the role of players in the game? There is none.
Yeah,
they are there to witness. Okay, their agency, like after you finish the session or the campaign, they are gonna be the game master and tell their own story. Like that's how they get agency.
Yeah. Also, I think I want to comment a couple of things you said. The first,
so maybe I can finish quickly because Point is, so if you understand, if you start to understand deeply that you as a player, you don't have influence over the story, like what are you going to do? Like what's there else to do for you? It's to roleplay, like it's to act out your character in the little bits of spotlight you're given, or worst case scenario, the spotlight you have to fight over with other players, because the story is about story. It doesn't assume doesn't have opportunities to place for role playing, so you have to fight for spotlight and then role play. Sometimes also because there's insistence on like the players have to perform as well. Actually, what you said, like the players are still expected to contribute.
Yeah.
But what they contribute is role playing, because in structure there's no room for it. Like the story is game master responsibility, so they have to fight for spotlight to contribute by role playing, because that's what there is. Because even some games in Poland, some games have stated explicitly that you like reward players for effort. You give them more experience points.
Yeah, like the Pavlovian.
Some games. It was like some post-Warhammer Polish games have this, like give more experience points to players who put more effort in. And how do you evaluate the effort? By, effectively how much they role played. So even they were doing the voices, they were putting in effort more than the player who was quiet all the time.
Yeah, so several different, a lot of different things that you said that are worth commenting on. So I think this again, it's not about a player type, it's just about a habit, right? But if you have these habits, then you get put into a context where you have agency and you don't know how to do it, right? And this is what I refer to with finding unskilled, what I feel is unskilled player or player with a bad habit. Actually, I have no problem with beginners. Beginners are great because they generally don't have these habits, so they're easier to teach. But when you talked about agency, it's really, really important to frame this in the context that situation also gives zero agency to the GM, because you are talking to yourself. So there's no one to confirm your thing, right? There's no one to tell you that you've made an action upon an external world and that that consequences of that action are something that you did. It's just you talking to yourself. And that is also, in my opinion, frustrating for a GM to do. In the long run, they might get social validation from it, but I think that there's little fun in that. And I think that the agency is something we have together. Like we create both the system and the different roles that we have in the game create this kind of like intersection of things that are going to happen, and this creates a little bit of an uncertainty space that has similar properties to real life in a sense. Like if you go out of your door and have to make a decision on your life, am I going to invest this money in this thing or not? You don't know how it's going to pan out. You need to make some sort of decision, and then later you're going to see the consequence of that decision, and you're going to say, oh yeah, I did this, so this happened, but I didn't know at the time because I didn't have full control over a situation, right? So obviously I'm simplifying a lot here because there's maybe 2 hours of philosophy that we could get into of what that means. But I think when you have this thing, then you're reacting to each other, and both the rules that you're using and the other players are creating this kind of space of uncertainty that then gets resolved later. And then you see that the consequence was born out of your choice or the thing that you decided to bring into play. That is the feeling of agency, right? So I did that, but at the time I didn't know that I was going to do it. And so if you know everything, then you, by definition, have no agency, even if you're deciding everything, because there's no one to bounce it off to, or there's no sort of uncertainty about anything. There are some games that do this with solo play, so I'm not saying that it's completely impossible, but because essentially they can hide your past self under rules, and then you feel you're interacting with somebody else. This is what the solo games do. But in general, if you don't have that type of mechanic, then that's what happens. Then I wanted to comment on another thing that you call them traditional games, and I understand this is very... I completely understood what you said, but I personally don't like that word because it erases the fact that there were plenty of games released in the 70s and early 80s that are not like that, and they don't follow the 90s philosophy. And
quick point, I'm using the nomenclature from the article 6 Cultures of Play, which defines the early games as classic games and then the 90s as traditional games. So
okay, fair enough.
The terms are a little bit confusing, but they kind of stuck, so I'm using it.
The reason that it kind of bothers me is actually related more to Italian culture than anything else, because for a long time there was this even denial that classic games, as you've described them, even existed. So everything was called traditional.
It wasn't real RPG back then. It's only became real after. And it is a lot. And maybe we can switch into the discussion about the indie movement, because I know you have that on your question list. If you want, or we can talk about it later. Yeah, we can we can just go into it. Yeah, sure.
But that's essentially when the Forge influence started appearing in Italy, and I think that it is shaped by the dysfunctions that were in Italy, very widespread at the time. So part of the idea that came up that wasn't really true in the context of the Forge forum, or in the context of whatever Ron Edwards or Vincent Baker ever said, or any of the influential personalities over there, is this idea that before the Forge, all role-playing was bad. And this is a very common idea in Italy. Very, very common in between these circles. And I think it's just fundamentally wrong. Like, it's factually incorrect. And a little bit was born out. So I'm not... I have a little bit of a trouble history with this community because I personally I'm very involved with this type of like kind of DIY indie publishing. I really like Creative Commons licenses. Like I believe in RPGs as sort of this kind of thing that everybody
Creative Commons
changes.
licenses. You mean like Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, we won. We won. I just want to say that victory was achieved. Yeah, I'm very, very, very happy about that. Very happy about that. But going back to this now we're in the timeline of the 2000s, like late 2000s, right? So maybe you have the Forge forum, which I'm sure like you've talked about the topic with Ron Edwards, so I don't want to get into it. But there's a few members of that Forge forum which were Italian, and then they tried to bring those ideas back to Italy. But they were colored by the state of kind of Italian RPG culture at the time, and also by their own limitations of like what they had experienced as role playing. And the other thing that they were colored by is the fact that like independent publishing in Italy is not very strong, or wasn't very strong at the time. So the way that independent publishing works in Italy is that you find a publisher. So there are it's a bit of a counter, it's a bit of a oxymoron, because you find a small publisher, so you are essentially not independent. This is because publishing anything in Italy requires you to be part of the people that do it, right? Otherwise you don't get in bookstores, you can't distribute, and there's no real bypassing that. And also the culture gives a lot of validity to things that are properly published, right?
I see.
Then the idea was that these guys set up these publishing houses because some of them had actually experience in media publishing within this system, this publishing system of Italy, and they started offering translation deals to Forge authors. But then by doing that, they turned that in from the point of view of, oh, look, we're building these games and it's all DIY and we're doing our own thing and I'm self-publishing it and I don't care if it's popular or not, to look at these shiny new games from the land of the Americas, all these great game designers from the influential forum, The Forge. We are bringing you this new wave of role-playing. And they literally use that expression, by the way, new wave. We're bringing you this new wave of role-playing games. They still sold it as a genre, as a bunch of things that are kind of similar to each other. And they are the selectors. We bring you the best games. The games previous to ours, they are not good. We bring you the good games, right? And so it was very kind of this mentality of, and the marketing really is going for this, right? And I think from one point of view, they have the credit to have brought some of these games to Italy in a way that in other countries is not present, or that came much later. Maybe when PBTA became popular, then they started bringing some story game stuff into those countries, like I'm thinking of France or Germany. But so they brought some of that stuff a lot earlier, which is a good thing, because I think the 2000s era is one of the best eras after the 70s of production of role-playing games. But on the other hand, they kind of betrayed the ideals of independent publishing, which was what Ron Edwards was really going for at the time. And inevitably over time, they started going more for the style than substance. And since the entire community was built around these ideas of we make the best games, the amount of self-reflection that was going on compared to the American version of that was very a lot smaller. There's a smaller group of people that I can probably count in the 20s that were actually doing self-reflection. And then there was a larger group of orbiters that were mostly in it for the kind of identitarian thing. So we are the counterculture, right? And and this, in my opinion, didn't really improve play in any way. It just kind of, they just started doing the same things that they were doing, but slightly differently. Now it's the power is distributed, so it's good.
Is it like the new orthodoxy? So
a little bit.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, Forge was like the Forge mentality and Forge games were against basically everything that tradition, like the 90s culture of RPGs did. which is part of it was questioning what seemed to be obvious. So like a lot of games that were trying to break all the rules that were established appeared. So was it the case that in Italy this kind of quickly became the new orthodoxy, and then you couldn't break rules?
Yes. Yeah, but like super quickly. A lot quicker than in the US, I would say.
Okay.
Like, there are people that I know that I consider friends. So I'm not necessarily criticizing people that I hate. I actually like a lot of these people. That they still have they have a knee-jerk reaction when they read Moldvay D&D, because structurally it looks like what they perceive as a traditional game, so it means it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay.
And these are people that I consider friends, so I'm not necessarily saying this in a destructive way. I wish that they would move past this. I wanted to get back to the indie scene, or the stuff that came out of the Forge, in Italy at least. So I think that like right now, that scene was very potent in the period between 2005 and 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And then it got eaten up by whatever came when the big PBTA train came through, which this is what now people tend to think of as indie RPGs, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's a bit of, we can call it the story game boom or whatever. Like it's the community that's based around the idea of story game as opposed to traditional game. And I think that ended up having a larger popularity, and it mostly overrode whatever community there was. So some people in that community that were there mostly for, again, the identitarian reasons just moved on to the next hot thing. And then the people that were actually doing self-reflection kind of went into almost monastic life. And I know some of those, and it's kind of interesting how they just kind of said, fuck it. Like all the work I did for these 5-10 years has meant nothing. And then they're like, oh, okay, I'm just not going to do any activism or community engagement anymore. I'm just going to play with the same 4 people, and I'm going to go stay in my house and not really interact at all. So it kind of that happened. The story game stuff is rather popular. I think it's right now more or less on par with everything else that has been going on with the international community. I think it's rather popular.
What are the most popular games?
Just anything PBTA.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
are they translated into Italian or?
Yeah. There's these, again, publishing houses that get translation deals. They do it quite a lot. Actually, if a game isn't translated into Italian, it usually is not popular here. Well, I'm not in Italy right now, but it's not popular there. Italians are used to having their stuff handed to them in their own language. So if it's not translated, it most likely will not get traction. Okay. And some of these publishing houses are the same publishing houses that were translating Forge games 10 years ago, and they just shifted to whatever, was going to sell copies, right? And I am kind of partly a little bit to blame for this. I have my share, because I actually translated Dungeon World in Italian, and I own dungeonworld.it.
Interesting. Okay.
And I made the community version, because for me, again, it's about Creative Commons. So the publishing company that translated Dungeon World is released under Creative Commons attribution license, so they don't need to share alike. They don't need to re-release it under Creative Commons. So the translation that they did was under traditional copyright, so people couldn't print it and reimagine it. So I did a translation that was also published under Creative Commons that I published on a website. And I contribute significantly to the popularity of Dungeon World in Italy, which is something that I am kind of regretting at the moment, but because I used to like that game a lot more than I like it now.
Okay, why?
I still think it's a great game, but it has its limitations, especially when it comes to like generally like understanding the various drives of the characters. Like it's not it's in that weird in between space being BX D&D, which is very clear on what you're doing there, and being some sort of like epic fantasy adventure, which also is not doing very well. And I think the strength of the game is the kind of inner loop of moves, the stuff that happens on the moment-to-moment basis. But when you look at the larger picture, it's quite deficient, in my opinion.
Okay.
I've played that. I'm probably one of the Italians that has played the game the most. So I'm also kind of highly aware of the limitations of it that maybe newer players are not.
Yeah.
And I've had to teach it to several people, also seeing the stuff that really new players struggle with. And so I don't think it's a bad game at all, but it definitely initiated a trend of like PBTA games that didn't really understand what Apocalypse World was about. And so I feel a little bit responsible of that, at least in Italy.
Okay.
I think Apocalypse World is an excellent game, and there are several PBTA games that are excellent, but it doesn't extend to the entire genre.
Yeah, I get what you mean. What's the most popular tabletop RPG in Italy? Like, top couple of them. What would you say?
Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, then Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, and Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is the third place.
Okay.
I would say after Dungeons and Dragons, maybe Vampire, the new edition, which I actually quite like. I think then, honestly, I'm not too much in the mainstream scene, and I've kind of lost track of what is popular there. It's every time I look, it's almost always entirely Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition.
I see.
But
because you were talking about the indie games, or like
yes,
whatever they are now, and you mentioned that they are super popular. I was just wondering, okay, so they're super popular.
They're super popular in contrast to other countries, to the indie scene or the story game scene in other countries.
Okay.
They have a very strong sub-community. It doesn't mean that by numbers they don't completely they're not completely overshadowed by D&D and other mainstream RPGs. They just are, but they have a strong sub-community that pulls regular decent sales as well. And I would say right there now the games that are most popular is like whatever PBTA is hot at the moment. And then maybe you were going to ask about Italian games. There's a game called Not the End that is particularly popular right now. There's I'm not particularly good at presenting Italian games, but there's a couple of games that are being made right now that are from Italian publishers that are in the Italian design sphere, but they are actually quite good in the PBTA space. And one of them is Fantasy World by Alessandro Piroddi, which is a very good friend of mine. I would say that game has been a hit in Italy, at least in this sub-community. And it's not been it's going to be released internationally this year, so we'll see how it does. I have my reservations because I think the publisher is not taking the international marketing seriously enough, but I might be wrong on that. Because obviously you've never heard of it, right? So
yeah, so far no.
Yeah, exactly. I think Alessandro has been doing a better job just going on international forums and talking about the game in English, and he's managed to convince some people, but I think the publisher doesn't really have enough context outside to properly convince people that this is a thing that's happening. But I'd say that game is rather popular right now because it came out this year in Italian. I would say Blades in the Dark and any John Harper game are really popular in this sub-community. If you think about what's popular in the Anglo story game community, that's pretty much what's popular over in Italy. At this point, they've merged.
Yeah, for better or for worse, I feel the indie community, again, similar in Poland, roughly. So maybe bits and pieces are different. So for better or for worse, we have globalized.
Yeah. Almost everything is being globalized right now. And again, I told you before about the difficulty that Italians have of exporting their own things. So then the things that they try to export don't become popular outside, and then they become overshadowed by whatever's coming from the US or the Anglosphere.
Yeah.
I would say also Monster Hearts is very popular. I think Monster Hearts is an excellent game, so I don't have. I think that's a good thing. So there's definitely some good things about the story game community, but in general, I find that they're very focused right now on just like riding the wave of whatever new release is coming out, and less on self-reflection and improving their own skills. So they're very focused on this idea of the new game is going to come out and it is going to make me play good without effort, right? And so this is something that I actively try to personally work against because I like to improve my skill. And so I find the community a bit grating because it's this kind of like let's all hug each other and be happy. So criticism or self-reflection is not perceived as good. So it's a lot of hype cycle and going on the latest game. Sometimes the latest game is good, but I still think that they lose on a lot of potential fun by also improving their skill because the game doesn't do everything. It gets you halfway there, and you have to put the other half yourself in.
Yeah, that's like the peculiar thing about tabletop RPGs, I think, specifically. Because, I mean, games in general make player contribute as well, but video games, it's the player contributes in limited ways, usually, very structured by the game. There's, again, some exceptions, I would guess, maybe some multiplayer games and whatnot, but yeah, like the amount of contribution I know it's like users, the players broadly understood, like including game masters, is just huge. And tabletop RPGs, it's what the medium has been wrestling with from the like its inception, I think. But speaking of like things published in Italy, I think now is the perfect time to talk about Brancalonia.
Oh no! So I don't know
because it's like the I think most known Italian culture expert.
Right. I think it's riding a lot on the popularity of the kind of Terence Hill and Bud Spencer movies. It's really trying to reference those. My opinion is that it's a funnier book to read. I don't really see the play value in it, but maybe people will disagree. It's not in my sphere of like stuff that I really follow or care about because I don't play D&D 5th edition, and it's D&D 5th edition.
It wasn't supposed to be at first, I think, but then they converted to 5th edition for marketing purposes, and it worked.
Yeah, I mean, good for them. But I think it's a lot funnier to read. Like it's almost sounds like a satire piece. So I'm not. I'm not that. I don't think that's very exciting. I don't think that's something very exciting coming out of our sphere of export. Definitely, it's one of the only things that they managed to export successfully. So that is a success, and that needs to be recognized as a success. But I would rather. Like, I really hope Fantasy World does really well. I genuinely like the game.
You don't want Brancalonia to be like the main expert of like, what did Italy do in tabletop RPGs? Brancalonia.
Yes. I think actually the idea is very funny. Like, it's very funny and it's really enjoyable to read, right? I actually like that. I think that if I were to want to play that, I would just ignore all of the rules in the book and just use something else. I actually think that the situation that is presented by the book is really funny. And
the setting seems interesting. A little bit of trivia in Poland. I don't think the source material was very known in Poland. So in Poland, again, it's like the Italian setting first and foremost.
Okay. Like I think in Germany they really hit it because they really like the Terence Hill and Bud Spencer films. Like if for whoever doesn't know, these are like kind of buddy cop movies or buddy comedies where these two are involved in all sorts of shenanigans and usually get into like bar fights with people and very cartoony slapstick humor where they punch the bad guys. they mostly punch them. It's like Bud Spencer is like this really big guy, and then Terrence Hill is this very skinny dude. He's the guy. He was also in some spaghetti westerns as well. But they're like a skinny guy and a large guy, and then they have these like physical comedy type of fights where the skinny dude is agile and the fat large dude is strong, almost cartoonishly so, and people love them. I love these films. They're very, very, very cool. But I think they didn't really get a lot of airtime outside of maybe Italy and Germany. I think Italy and Germany really, really like these. I'm not exactly sure about the rest of Europe. But
the thing,
maybe
like, the idea of something being popular in Italy and Germany is funny. Is it like Holy Roman Empire vibes still?
I also read the English version, and I think actually they changed or removed some reference in favor of larger Italian culture references from the outside. Okay. So it might be that some of the Bud Spencer and Terrence Hill references are a little bit less obvious. I think it's also a satire on Italian culture. I think
it looks like it.
It's very funny. I think the authors are very funny people. My impression is that the book doesn't provide a lot of like actual play value from the point of view of rules. And if I were to play it, I probably switch the system completely and just use something else for it.
I think that was the impression of many people. Yeah, we did a quick overview of Brand Colonia on our channel, and I think our impression, like mine for sure, was that interesting setting. I don't know why I need D&D 5th edition to play it. So I could just take, I don't know, any OSR game maybe and run the setting if I like it.
Yeah, actually some old school games might actually be better for it because they have this kind of explosive quality to their outcomes where like anything can happen, and you can also get kind of die stupidly.
Because, the new editions like D&D 3rd edition and forward are very safe in their structure.
Yeah, they're almost, I call them superhero games.
I do the 5th one for sure. Yeah,
5th edition is like almost a supers game.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like yep. Okay,
that leads nicely into OSR because I think that's one of the best things that's happening in Italy right now. I am not a big fan of the international OSR. Not generally because I don't like old. As I said, I really like games that came out of the 70s and early 80s, and I'm a big fan of BXD&D, which is a foundational text for some of these people. I'm just kind of turned off by some of the kind of archaeological, I think pseudo-archaeological claims made by some parts of the OSR community, the American OSR community. And I'm also turned off by some, I guess, grognardia nastiness of it. And generally, I do like a lot of games that come out of it, but not necessarily with the atmosphere. My favorite people from the American scene are Chris McDowell and Yokai Gal. I think they're excellent writers. I think they're excellent designers. And the Italian scene, since we didn't have BX, I think when the Red Box, the Mensa Red Box came to us, the 90s thing was already getting started, right? So we never had old school stuff in Italy, like as it is understood today. So there is no archaeology to be done. And I think that's, even though I think maybe people in that time probably had a lot of fun, I think that the kind of archaeology done by the old school community, the Anglo-Americans old school community, has got stuck into some stuff that is more myth than actual reality. And they're kind of stuck in some conversations that can't go forward because of that. I know that there's a thing called jokingly the NSR, which is also where Chris McDowell has gone and whatever. Like I think it's a joke, and I know they understand it as a joke because I think as a name it's pretty stupid.
But the name is used in Polish fandom for sure. So
we in Italy we have no need for that because the OSR in Italy is the NSR. Like there's no difference because the people that sorry we are already. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just quick note. In Poland, again, we use the OSR name, but again, like those games didn't exist in Poland, really. So, but we think in the American terms.
Right. So I think when the kind of OSR scene was founded. So it's the people that are kind of leading the groups right now. So I don't consider myself an old school player because I play everything. I do my own stuff. I play stuff that I find fun, but I don't necessarily. But definitely among all the communities in Italy, that is the one that I find the most likable, because they are very focused on all this DIY stuff, on the Creative Commons aspect, on actual independent publishing, which means like I'll print it on some toilet paper and give it out at conventions for free, which I love. I love this idea of ashcan stuff that gets given out and that then you edit it and modify it yourself. And I like the idea of not bringing the commercial aspect into it, even though sometimes it's good to have a commercial aspect into it. I think that in that first phase of like figuring out what is fun, that the commercial aspect is damaging. Then later, if you have a thing that is already fun and you just want to spread it, maybe the commercial aspect, the marketing has a place. But so it's very experimentative. And most of these guys, so one of these guys, the person that I jokingly call the Pope of the Italian OSR, which is a complete joke, but don't take this seriously at all, is Francisco Pettigiani, sorry. And he's known on the internet as Dismaster's Den or something like that. And he used to have a blog that it was in the OSR Anglosphere. And then at a certain point, he decided to transition that into Italian. And that is what actually got this to the attention of Italians everywhere. And it turns out he's a really positive guy, like one of my favorite people in the entirety of Italy. And so the way that he presented this affected how everybody else came together about this. And I think his influence on the Italian OSR scene cannot be understated. He is really a centerpiece of it, even though he tries to minimize his influence as much as possible. I have a lot of respect for this guy. And it turns out that a lot of the people that got into the kind of OSR scene were like fans of Yokai Gal or Chris McDowell. So a lot of people are playing Into the Odd and all of the Cairn-based games. And it's very eclectic, and it's very, friendly, but also like they don't like to follow trends. They're like everybody's doing their own thing. And last year they had a convention in Milan called TPK, Total Party Con. And I was there, and it's been my favorite event that I've ever attended in Italy at all. And so I think the Italian OSR is superior to the Anglo-American OSR in that the things that are happening in Italy are by no way unique. They're happening in the Anglo-American sphere as well, but they're mostly the good parts. There's no racist trolls or anything like that. So I know that there's a part of the Anglo-American OSR that is toxic or whatever. We don't have that. So I really like hanging out with those people. I don't necessarily play those games all the time, but and I think that some of them could use some variance in their role-playing habits. But it's probably the most positive and also play-focused community that exists. So that I really cannot speak well of it enough. And
seems like OSR seems to be a good antidote to a community very much immersed in the game master tells the story culture of play.
Yes, yeah,
because OSR seems to be focused very much on like the player experience and just having fun as the player and interact with the game as a player. So, yeah, in many ways, it's a perfect antidote.
Yes, from a certain point of view, it is. I think that they have some limitation because when they get out of these traditional settings like the dungeon or the wilderness, and we get into some more like drama-heavy contexts, then their play skills they haven't generalized their skills of play, their play skills, so they sometimes fumble or stumble through these aspects, and they do come up even in their games sometimes, and I almost always see them fumble. I think with fumble, I don't mean fudging rolls. I mean they stumble through it.
Yes.
I think the only people that I don't see doing that are people that have a wider they play a wider type of games, and so they understand how those skills generalized. But in general, I agree with you. It's one of the most places that is most unabashedly pursuing just fun in the without having to stand by any sort of threshold for what is a good story or what is a bad story or what is we're even doing here. They just don't give a fuck, and I really like that. It's not that I don't want to have a good story out of my role-playing game, but I don't think that comes out by planning it. I think it comes out naturally because we are humans and we have story psychology inbuilt our brain.
Yeah, so far in the OSR movement, I've seen there's a huge emphasis on authenticity of the experience.
Yeah.
So like whatever story we have, we want it to be like feel real. So we want the story to come out of simulation and like real stuff, and not game master deciding arbitrarily before the game that this NPC is going to walk in during this scene and it's going to be dramatic. So they want things like it, and also like authentic emotional experience.
Yeah, I think when where that idea stops, like where it's limited, is when a game master stops doing their job. Like I think there's a specific, I've seen this happen like last week from a friend of mine. So again, I'm not speaking of people that I despise. I'm speaking of friends that I want to guide through into a higher state of play, let's say. But I've seen this happen where a game master is scared to introduce coincidence because they're like, I have to be neutral. Right. But what they don't understand is that coincidence is the only way that you get something that is some sort of story or fun to play. Right. If there is no coincidence, if the adventurer never chooses to go in the dungeon, if you never stumbled upon the dragon egg, if you didn't cross paths with your worst enemy that day, then there's nothing to tell. There's nothing to talk about, right? And I think that they conflate that with overriding player input, and they don't know where the line is. So they prefer to not do anything, and that creates static play. The only place where that doesn't create static play is the dungeon, because if you're not doing anything, time passes, or the wilderness. If not, you're not doing anything, time passes, so you're wasting resources. So the situation changes anyways. But if you're outside of that context, then that is actively like not doing your job. And so as a game master, to create the necessary coincidence for fun to happen is not, as long as you're not overriding anything that's been said before, or you're not invalidating any choice that's been made before, then I think in general you should be free to choose coincidental stuff to create situations that are interesting. And I think a lot of people in the OSR kind of feel that they can't do that, or they don't know where the line is.
Yeah, I think like OSR is very much aware of classic games turning into the monster that was the late 90s culture, story focused culture of play, and like they don't want to do this again.
Yeah.
So they're very cautious of any, like almost any story, even like any decision to focus on the story or do anything motivated by the sake of a story.
Right, but you don't even have to introduce the word story for it, because you could just say that it's not fun if there is no ogre or going around, right?
Yeah, but you can also argue like my problem with OSR like maybe is that if the game goes for long enough, I feel like the story might start to emerge, but I feel like at some point you have to care about the structure a little bit.
Yes.
You cannot you cannot stay in the first act forever, like introducing new characters and plots and never resolving anything. At some point you have to stick to something, and sometimes a little bit of story magic, so like we continue to focus on this arc until its completion, like has to happen, and not
which is not necessarily, I highly agree with this. It's not necessarily forcing the story into any direction. It's just saying, hey, these items continue reoccurring. We now are solving them together, right? We're not saying when it will happen. We're not saying how it will happen. We're just saying, okay, these are the things we are involved in at the moment. Let's continuously try to bring them forward and see what happens. Now, obviously, if the players actively say that they're not interested, that it needs to be a shared interest in resolving this, right? So if they're not interested in resolving it, then the GM can turn it into a background thing and then just tell them how it goes over time. But if we are all interested in resolving it, then there's no reason not to make it reoccur and to create the necessary coincidences, I've said, to make it reoccur. And that's not really railroading. I don't think that's railroading. It's railroading if you're forcing it into an outcome. And I think it's fine to care about the structure of the story if you're noticing it after it happens and not trying to make it happen. You're not, oh, okay, I'm going to make the climax happen now.
Yeah,
I think that's bad.
Yeah, that would be the role-playing dream of nobody caring about the story, but the story is, and with good structure happening anyway.
Right. But if you look at what's happened in the past, and certain things that had to be resolved somehow continuously come forward, and at a certain point they all come to a boiling point and they kind of explode and resolve everything, and now there's a denouement, then you can look at that and say, oh wow, that was a climax, but I didn't make it happen. It just happened because, again, of the nature of the psychology of everything involved, that we are story creatures and we made it happen, right?
Yeah, although I think the movement, the OSR, I mean, RPGs in general, but OSR more specifically struggles with what's the role, like how aware of it can you be, and how much can you direct it consciously? Yeah, how much can you think about the story, and how much of it can be given to the mechanics that maybe go after some point. You have to keep reintroducing the previous elements and not create new ones. You can do it like OSR style. So we had this idea that maybe whatever you roll into with random tables, you just note it and you construct a new random table with those elements, and that's the table you're going to be rolling on after it's completed, let's say.
That's a great idea, actually. I should tell my friends about that. That sounds like a great idea.
Feel free to use it. Like like that. Yeah, that RPG would try to do some structure, but still keep it emergent. Yeah.
And I think the opposite side. So that's kind of like a reactionary way of responding to, again, the 90s, what you call traditional gaming idea of the good story, that it needs to be forced on play. And I think the story games way of doing it is kind of a different reaction, which is like, okay, like, so if a single person doing it is bad, they were going to give power to everybody. But then, like, oftentimes, again, I like some games that come out of that scene, so I'm not saying that everything is like this. And also, I'm not talking necessarily about games as text, but I'm talking about also play culture, right?
Yeah.
But I think oftentimes it turns into just negotiating what's going to happen. And so that's a different way of kind of railroading each other, if you will, accept the stretch. It's not discovering, but it's just kind of making it happen together. And I think that kind of, for me at least, defeats the purpose of role playing, which is getting to know, like discovering what is going to happen by acting through the system, and not by talking to each other or winking or doing this kind of chaotic improv that is very popular in story game circles.
I think it's what I call screenwriting games.
Yes,
it's a bunch of screenwriters in a room that come up with the story together, and I think that's one advantage Poland has over the especially English tabletop community, which is the hobby in Poland is called gry fabularne. So like it's plot games, story. Okay, a literal translation would be story games, but the story games it means something different in English. So, and like the screenwriting games fit within story games easily in terms of a concept. So, like role playing games, it could be like something more specific in Poland, where you role play your character. So I think I like the name in Poland, that it fits this broad category of games that I define as games where where the fiction is more important than the mechanics. So it's a game that you could feasibly play without mechanics.
Right.
So and it includes screen. If you come up with story together, there is a game master, there's no game master, there's 1 player, there's 10 players, whatever. It includes Fiasco, it includes Warhammer, D&D, PBTA games.
Yeah, I think that there's a specific line, though, and it's a line not necessarily again in the game text, because some game texts can tend to either way, depending on how you play them. Some game texts are more forced. I would definitely put Fiasco in the category of like what I don't consider a role-playing game, even though it's a fun improv game. It's very much dependent, and I've played a lot of Fiasco, so I'm not speaking out of ignorance. And what would classify for me as like a game that is essentially focused on the yes and kind of like almost like we're in improv theater context. So it's more about like, it actually really works well with an audience because of that. Because if you are playing off of an audience, then the game essentially is just giving you prompts, and you're reacting to the prompts, and you're trying to make something up that makes sense and that is funny or that is cool.
Yeah, my friend from the channel is actually did improv, and he's like, yeah, Fiasco, it's totally just, it's an improv exercise. Yeah,
it's an improv exercise. And so I think that's not role-playing as it is conceived as other games, right?
Fair enough.
But if you play Apocalypse World, you are playing through the systems. The outcomes are not discovered by us improvising. We are making stuff up, obviously, but the outcomes are discovered by playing through a system. So I consider that a very kind of different type of thing that you're doing, and that is more compatible with all the kind of old school stuff. Those are, I feel, are in the same category, but doing different things. But then the improv stuff that is in some story games, and Fiasco maybe is the cleanest example of it. I feel it's a different activity. I don't necessarily mean that it's bad or anything, but it's something that existed already, and we're just creating a structure around it, because theater people have been doing this since for thousands of years. So I'm not. I don't think that's. Yeah.
Then you could get into discussions like, so if some Germanic tribesmen, some Lombards back in early Middle Ages sat around a fireplace, and were telling a story together, and one of them played like more dominant role, like, you know, maybe they did role-playing games, maybe they did Dungeons and Dragons.
I don't know. We don't have any evidence of that, but sure, maybe they did. But what I'm saying is that having played both types, and the play experience to me feels like a different thing.
I get it. Although I would argue, like, is Fiasco that different than some PBTA where players also contribute a lot?
It depends, because some PBTA, especially later ones, seem to be built for this.
While like Gauntlet community PBTA games like Hearts of Woolen, Brindlewood Base.
I think that's other PBTAs, like Apocalypse World is definitely not built for this, but it is used for this, which is different.
Yes.
I like some of the stuff coming out of Gauntlet, but generally I would say that this type of improv is what that site is focused on. From my perspective, as a also participant sometimes, or as at least I write on the forum sometimes. So I don't think all of it is. And the problem that I have with late PBTA is, again, that they are not interpreting Apocalypse World in the way that I think it can be played effectively. And so they're essentially, the objective of the moves has become some sort of like writing prompt. Okay, when this happens, we roll this die, and then it creates some prompt for us to continue and make some other stuff up.
Yes.
So they misinterpreted the idea of play to find out into kind of make stuff up as you go.
Or like interpreted it. I consider it valid games. Although I could argue that we should have a different word than PBTA for those games.
Right, because PBTA is not a system.
Calling them something different.
I don't think PBTA is a system, right? Like there are some PBTA that are legitimately role-playing games. They're very clearly role-playing games. Like Monster Hearts is absolutely clearly, unavoidably to be played with an agency mindset, and others that are not. I think it's just a way to write manuals. And actually, if you look at what Vincent Baker has been doing recently, Vincent Baker is the game designer of Apocalypse World. He has been trying to clarify the design process of it on his blog. He wrote like a 6-7 part series on like what PBTA is and how it's structured and why it's done the way it is. I think personally that maybe he feels a little guilty. I don't claim to look into his head or anything. I'm just like, maybe he's trying to correct this, or maybe not. I don't know.
I've read a couple of those, I think, and
I think they're excellent articles.
Yeah, they were interesting, but I would go as far as say that I'm not sure I agree with Vincent Baker as to what's crucial for PBTA. So
I don't think there's anything crucial. It literally just, if you write your rules as moves, at this point you're a PBTA. Like you can be a completely different game and people are still going to call you PBTA.
Yeah, this is a digression. Like let's go back to Italy in a minute. But
sorry.
Yeah, I'm guilty of digressions as well. So like we're both guilty today. But it's so I think Vincent Baker has said that moves are not intrinsic to PBTA, that game as a conversation is intrinsic, and that moves are accidental. You can have PBTA game without moves.
Yeah.
I would argue with that. I mean, if you leave a game as a conversation is super broad. So at this point, what is a PBTA game really? I think it's going into arguing philosophy area, which I don't like in game design because this is like endless conversation. So I would define PBTA as something more concrete. I consider moves to be very important as a way to structure the fiction. And like basically whenever you want to have a significant change in fiction, it has to be a move, or like should be a move. But otherwise, yeah, but for sure, Apocalypse World is different than Gauntlet PBTA, let's call it for now. So like I could see an argument being made for let's have a new name for this. Maybe Gauntlet PBTA, maybe something different, because is it really PBTA?
Again, I don't mean to do an essentialist take on it. Like I don't really care what people name things. All I care is that in the actual practical play experience for me has been very different. So again, the game that I was recommending earlier, which is Fantasy World, is definitely written in the style of Apocalypse World and with the understanding of how Apocalypse World works. So it's more in the style of earlier PBTA, if you will, than later. Now, I generally don't want to make an argument over what people can call things or should call things. I don't really care about that. I just care about fact that I see the play experience is starkly different that I've had with different games, with different groups and different play cultures. And some of these are compatible, some of these are not. So this is essentially what I was trying to say. And we can get back to your questions about Italy. I'm sorry, like I have lots and lots of opinions. So
I enjoy these conversations very much. I'm just thinking, but okay, I will edit it somehow. Like
sure,
we'll see. So back to Italy.
Yeah.
Let me think about the order of questions. Okay, so let's finish the tabletop RPGs in Italy bit, and then finish off with like go back to like Italian stereotypes in culture and tabletop RPGs.
Right.
So finishing tabletop RPGs in Italy, I think you already said it, but like a typical session, a typical game in Italy, what would it look like if you were to enter? Like, what would be the expectations that maybe are not obvious to like other people from other countries? Like, and what would happen on a typical Italian sessions? Like, what type of settings, what type of quests would be the most prominent? What types of maybe plot twists? Like,
I think it depends on the sub-community that you get in contact with. So if you go into the mainstream, the very expectation is the game master has written a story. We're going to be actors in it. So this is the type of thing. I don't think there's anything particularly Italian about what they're doing. I think maybe the amount of there's this understanding that like, oh, Italians like to chit chat a lot and like be funny or whatever, do a lot of fun stuff. So kind of like, but it's similar to, since again, games are essentially social conversations. It's the same stuff that you would expect from Italians in a social setting. So people maybe are going to speak up more or be a little bit loud, interrupt each other, kind of get emotional a little bit, like in a performative way, like we tend to do. I think this is pretty much what you can expect. I don't think there's anything particular to story structure that is inherently Italian. I think if you go into the OSR stuff, their parts, I think it's you can expect what maybe other countries would call maybe NSR. So like lots of Into the Odd, lots of these like kind of funny dungeons full of weird stuff. There's this game made by a friend of mine called Terror Target Gemini, which is considered in the OSR sphere, but it's kind of really weird and modern, and it's also written like a comic book. If somebody ever I can't really describe it if you haven't played it, but it's very funny. Made by Luca Negri. I think they will translate that to English at some point, hopefully. I think if you end up going to these types of conventions, then you will get a very different experience than going to like the main convention in Luca Comics, right? Luca Comics is maybe the biggest place for comics and role-playing games in Italy. And then if you go into the kind of indie role-playing / story game stuff, you find what a culture of what has been called GWEP, GWEP, which stands for gut-wrenching emo porn, which is
Monster Hearts.
Yeah, it's their interpretation of Monster Hearts. Again, I don't necessarily agree that that's a good description of Monster Hearts play, but it's essentially
it's a play you can have using Monster Hearts.
Very melodramatic interpretation of certain story games or Forge games, where you are acting out your emotions a lot, or you're kind of, again, trying very hard to get bleed with the character. I think it sometimes goes into performative mode where you're doing it for the others more than for yourself. But again, this is a thing that you find. And then there's a couple of people that are a lot into like these two-player games like Mars Colony, Slay With Me. I think that's actually excellent. That's one of my best friends in Italian community, Daniele Di Rubbo, is a big proponent of these games. I think they get like really intimate with the other person. So it's kind of like, it's difficult to do it with random people. You need to do it with a friend. But there's definitely a culture of variety. So we are, again, 60 to 70 million people in Italy. So there's lots of different kinds of role players. So I definitely cannot speak for all of them. But I hope I've answered your question, sort of a...
Yeah, I'm gonna like add an extra question. So yeah, also about the more like trivial stuff, but I think like I would like to have a picture. So where do you play, for example? Do you play like, pubs or at homes, or like what's the tip? Like, yeah, what do you play? And
okay,
I know it's a stereotype, but food, is it important? Like, do you have like, is it a dinner and a game maybe, or I'm just throwing random ideas? I don't know.
There's a convention called GnoccoCon, where fried gnocchi is the main attraction. So yes, yeah, food is important. The catering at conventions is very looked after, I feel. I think also, like, if you go to Luca Comics, usually there's lots of little shops where you can like buy local food. Usually overpriced because there's a convention going on.
Obviously, yeah.
Where do we play? So there's a concept that I haven't seen outside of Italy, which is ludoteca, which means essentially a library for board games, which then gets extended to role-playing games.
Okay, because
So,
Ludo like is a play, like something.
Yes, so biblioteca means a place to store books.
Yeah, and it's a
And
place to play.
ludoteca is like a place to store games, right? So there's this concept. Some of these are in like the basement of a bar, where the bar has like a main bar and then there's a ludoteca inside. Some of them are actual ludoteca, which is mostly for games, and then there's a little bit of like you can order food or drinks or whatever, but it's mostly to go to play games. And usually it involves the ability to borrow games. Here in Helsinki, I've seen these types of places, but they're usually called like gaming cafes.
Yes.
Well, in Italy, it would rather be called ludoteca. There are also some places which are like kind of publicly funded, and this is very good. I like that Italy does this as like kind of social spaces. There's this tradition of kind of public spaces that can be rented for free, can be occupied for free, that are kind of managed by some non-profit associations with involvement from the local governments. So there's one in Milan, which is actually where the Total Party Con was held, and the space was given out for free to the organizers, so they didn't have to rent anything. They just said, "Hey, like, can we have this for this day, this amount of people?" And then they're like, "Okay, you can have these tables and whatever." And so this is kind of like community center almost type of thing. So I don't know exactly how to describe it, but
I think I get the picture. Yeah.
There's community centers that have board gaming or role-playing activity in them, right? So these are actually really big type of, like, there's lots of these around Italy. And then the other thing that happens is what's called associations, which it means like a non-profit, which is usually a way for people to get together and have some sort of legal entity of people, of a large amount of people that want to play together in a local area. In a way that you can interact with the government, right? So again, if you're just a guy, then the government is not going to take you seriously. But if you're a nonprofit association, then the government may take you more seriously if you're trying to book public spaces for your stuff. It is a bureaucratic nightmare, as anything in Italy is, but some people are very masochistic or care about role-playing enough to do this. So this is a very common thing. So usually in every medium to large town, there will be one or two of these local gaming associations that organizes common play spaces that are maybe done in coordination with some local government. Sometimes it really depends on where you are, but I would say that every large town has at least one of these, if not two.
Okay. But I would assume there's still a lot of playing happening at homes.
Yes, the vast majority, I would say. So another thing that happens that's been very popular in the last few years is what's called RPG blind date. So there's it's a format where there's going to be a one shot, but you don't know what game it is. And their only rule is that whatever content is prepared for that one shot needs to not have ever been played before in that area. So you can't repeat a one shot that you've done already in that place. Okay. There is a sort of a hierarchical organization of these blind dates that are headed by one main guy in Italy. I don't necessarily like this because I'm more into distributed stuff, but they have a little bit of a brand, even though it's a non-profit thing. And then they will say RPG blind date in this place at this time. You sign up and then you go and you have like an experience you wouldn't have before. I think it's a good idea. I think it's generally a fun thing. And I haven't really seen it outside of Italy. So it was like an idea of a couple of guys and then they kind of spread it. So it's quite fun.
Experimenting with something similar here in Krakow, but like we did it like a couple of times with one pub. Didn't turn into a big thing. It wasn't exactly this, but sort of similar. They're like an event would be organized and game masters would propose games. Like I would run this. They would be incentivized to like, okay, this is science fiction edition, so propose any indie science fiction game that you want to run. and then people from the internet could sign up. You would meet, and usually it would be strangers. So you would meet the game master for the first time. You would play the game. Although I think those events they quickly tend to be taken over by people who just want to play continuously.
Right, okay.
So just a couple of editions, and it's the game master and the 3 out of 4 players are his friends who just, I don't know, knew the guy and just used the opportunity to play with him and just one new person.
Yeah. No, I think I don't know how they've managed to be this successful, but they have. I think maybe to the credit of this hierarchical way of organizing it that I dislike, maybe that is the case. They have a brand, so now people go into their city, and if there's a thing that has that brand on it, they kind of know what to expect in the sense of how it's going to be organized and what type of people are going to run it. And it's that type of experience where you might get to play Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, or you might get to play some game scribbled on a piece of toilet paper. So, nice. And people are generally...
Good. Sounds really good, like a good... especially for
positive.
For promoting other ways of playing and meeting people. That sounds great.
Yes, I think it is. I think it's a very positive development that's been happening in the last few years. So I personally really like that. I've been trying to convince some of the local gaming bars here in Finland to do it, but they mostly left it to me, and I don't think it works if it's just me doing it. It needs to be some sort of event. So I need to start convincing more people that it's a worthwhile thing to do. But I think it's something that if you take one thing from Italy and imitate it, I think that's the one thing that probably you should imitate.
Okay, spaghetti carbonara and
RPG blind dates. Yeah,
those could be combined somehow.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
The carbonara blind dates.
I mean, I can eat a lot of carbonara, so you don't. If there's an RPG attached to it, come on.
Yeah.
Okay. So as for the what would be happening within the game, is there any typical things that you think are connected to it, that Italians like to have on their session and in their sessions? I know a specific type of NPC that comes up a lot, or there always have to be a traitor who was secretly your father. I don't know what it could be, so I don't know how to ask, but I don't know if you get the gist of the question.
Yeah, I don't. Nothing particular comes to mind. Okay. I think it's more or less the same tropes that I've seen anywhere else. Okay. I think maybe lots of Italian culture is based on status play, coming from the old ancient Roman client patron system that never really died. It actually kind of degenerated into the culture we have today, which is, in my opinion, rather unproductive. But anyways, I think sometimes this gets maybe seeps through into role-playing stories where maybe the idea is that there's always some sort of status thing going on. I think status is an element of most stories, so I don't think it's particular to Italy, but maybe the fact that we are low status and there's a high status patron, or there's we are high status and there's lower status people. This type of kind of stuff, I think, is they're very Italian problems. I don't think they're unique to us in any way, but it's a thing that maybe I see come up maybe more than often.
Yes, I guess the emphasis might be maybe more often in Italy. So I'm assuming in a medieval sort of setting, that would be different nobles, different houses.
Yeah, that type of stuff is really popular. This idea, the Game of Thrones stuff, where the there's this house and that house and this other house, and it's it looks like fucking Italian Renaissance. Everybody's infighting, sisters are fucking their brothers. That's essentially what was happening in Italy in the Renaissance. So the Pope is not really a Pope. The Pope is really has a wife, has a secret lover somewhere.
Okay. Oh, do you think romantic themes are more prevalent in Italian gaming than I don't know, I don't know what the word.
What do you mean by
average is.
romantic? You mean like love, or you mean like
erotic? Like broadly
erotic.
understood romance, like characters romancing together, the love affairs being the topic, and so on.
I think in the indie scene, actually, yes. Like, I think there's, in the indie scene, there's quite a little bit, but it's kind of like taken from Monster Hearts. Like, some people really are into Monster Hearts, and then they do it with a lot of other games. There's a lot of, I would say yes, but not in the general audience. I feel that in the general audience, there's a feeling that this stuff is icky, and they don't want to do it. And then,
I feel like a typical Dungeons and Dragons game, either in the US and Poland, wouldn't have romance. It wouldn't be the first type of story you would go for, especially if you're like 16 years old and you're teenage boys in a basement. Like, it's not the story you're comfortable with the most.
I think not. I think if it ever happens, it's in the type of play that is like, I seduce the priestess type of thing, right? Like, not very mature.
Did I sense a gamer's quote?
Yes.
Gamers respect.
Yeah.
That's a fucking great movie.
And I think, though, if you're talking about romantic literature, so again, romantic literature doesn't mean romance in the sense of love, but it means in the sense of like this idea of the sublime. For example, Tolkien is a very good example of romantic literature. Actually.
Okay, you mean like the cultural, or how do you call it? It's not really historical period, but like period of culture. You mean it's like before positive?
Yeah, I mean,
Polish names.
Again, I'm not a historian, or I don't have a degree in literary studies. So
but it's, I think, like late 18th century, early 19th century.
Yes.
The themes of mysticism. Also love, but more like the broader context of passion, of emotions being more important than rational decisions. Yeah. So
I think that this is very present in Italian culture, because one of the most important literary pieces of Romanticism was written in Italy. Now, I don't know how much this is appreciated outside of Italy. I know it was at the time, like in the period. I know it was appreciated, but I don't necessarily know how much it is appreciated now. But it's a novel called The Betrothed, like the people that are going to have to marry, essentially. So if you don't know what that means, or if somebody listening doesn't know what that means, I promessi sposi, so the promised married, essentially. I don't know how to explain that, but
spouses, right?
Spouses, yeah, exactly. The promised spouse or something. So essentially, the story is these two characters who live in the north of Italy, and during I think Spanish or Austrian occupation, and one local overlord noble really wants to get with the girl, and so he tries to make the wedding not happen, so he can then kidnap her and essentially, do bad stuff to her, let's say.
Yeah.
And so they escape, and there's this story where they get separated and they go all over Italy, and then at some point they kind of magically meet each other again during the plague, and they're all both magically kind of reunited, almost as if it was God's will that they do. And I think this theme of providence is kind of like almost the same as in Tolkien. So I think like this type of stuff, where there's kind of some sort of transcendental element, and the emotions are important, and the kind of spiritual part of the story is important. This book was very influential in Italian culture, like very influential. I do think that this stuff shows up. So maybe that if we talk about romantic literature in general, I think that romantic themes do pop up, especially in fantasy stories.
Okay. I think we're the last bit.
Yeah,
the last bit is upon us, which is the stereotypes, which like a couple of them have appeared already. So my perspective is this: okay, sometimes when we play in Poland, we would of course use stereotypes of other nations every now and then.
Yeah.
Sometimes because the setting is actually that, for example, you do have an Italian character. Yeah. Sometimes it's based on Italy. So now that I think of like what stereotypes do we have of Italians in general, especially in culture of Italians? I think there's a couple of archetypes or a couple of stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that I think is most also appears in Polish culture in general is of young Italian men. Like he's young and there's a little bit of like machism of he's a little bit of a macho, but he's romantic.
Yeah,
He's the Italian lover stereotype.
yeah, that's like a Southern Italian thing, I'd say. But
Yeah,
that is actually true. That exists.
Yeah, that would make sense. Like the guy who would recite poetry to women on the street, the guy who would maybe whistle for women, that he would like I use a lot of perfume, possibly, that usually would be pretty handsome.
Yeah.
Like Italian. There is this map that, what nationality do you like from what nation are men considered the most sexy by country?
Yeah.
And like 90% of Europe says Italy.
Yeah, I think that's
and then 9% say Brazil, and Italy says Sweden.
I think it's a little bit of exoticism going on. Like maybe women from those countries go on vacation in Italy and they enjoy the attention, but if they actually live there, they would find it extremely grating and offensive, right? I think that it's offensive and grating for the women living there. Most of them, at least I would say, they don't enjoy it, or it's not considered positive in the context where it happens. Somebody else might have a different opinion about this, but I generally think it's a bit uncouth.
But I've seen in culture like both stereotypes exist. So one of is like this guy who would it's not harass. I wouldn't call it harass. I mean, it could turn into harassment, but just the guy who would chat up random women on the street, and be a little bit pushy, maybe. But the other part is the guy who's like actually really charming, who is actually romantic, who has who knows how to drink wine, who knows how to treat a lady, who knows poetry and can recite it. So there's both sides of the coin for this.
I think there is you're right. I think there's a lot of pursuing the humanities in Italy as like a cultural thing. So it's not felt necessarily as like, oh, I'm going to go there and waste my studies, even though from the economic perspective it is. So there's a lot of people that kind of read and have I would say, higher than average level of literacy. And instruction and education. And I think that there's a specific kind of person that genuinely likes that and likes that type of conversation. And then there's the food culture as well. So I can understand where that comes from. I think that has a speck of reality in it, the positive version and the negative version. I think we, on the other hand, have what you're missing is the other side of that stereotype, which is the mama boys. So
yeah, we also have that because so maybe the next one in general is so a typical Italian would be a family man, like someone who's usually has a large family, is maybe less with his family, would have brothers and sisters, would I've heard it maybe would live with their parents until they're 30 at least. And mom is super important. Also, mom cooks the best.
Yes. And everyone's mom is the best cook in Italy.
Yeah. Well, I've also heard about grandmas being the best cooks. But I mean, it follows, right? Because the mom of a mom should be the even better cook because it's double layers of mom.
Yes.
It's So there's this also of the default assumption an Italian is extroverted.
Yeah.
Sometimes also neurotic in terms of maybe processing negative emotions out loud.
Yeah.
So anger, sadness, whatnot would be expressed loudly. And the cooking bit is food is important overall, which also turns off like Italian chefs as a stereotype. I think this might be more new. Maybe I'm in a bubble with YouTube, like Italian chef, one who would be a very good cook, but also very much insist that people should make the dishes in a traditional way, and that other people know nothing about food, maybe except the French, but not really. So there's this, and so maybe so let me finish with a list, because I have one more archetype, which is the Italian mafioso.
Right, yeah. It's a sad one because for people outside of Italy, it's kind of a joke, but it's not.
but this one, I am aware that this is imported from US probably. I don't think it's a stereotype that existed in Poland really before American media. So of course, Godfather and whatnot. So, and this would be like, especially the south of Italy, mafia families, and just the Sicilian mafia basically. And this would be mafioso that would dress well. A strong, again, family man, but also insisting on high status. Again, very masculine in terms of behavior, strong, and also mafia. So he would order a beating up of someone or assassination every now and then, but he would eat pasta and drink good wine while doing it.
Yes, this is 100% true, I would say. And the reason that the stereotype is Sicilian is because the Sicilian mafia moved to New York, where now they are the big, the New York Sicilians are more important almost than the Italian Sicilians. I'm not, aware of the recent developments, but I know that at least they are richer. They have more money going around. The type of mafia that is very present in Northern Europe and also Northern Italy. But again, they are present as this sort of like kind of underbelly. So they don't want to be known, right? Is the Neapolitan mafia. Or no, wait. No, sorry. The other one, the third one, I think is the Apulian mafia. Yes, the Apulian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta. I might be mixing them up. They have weird names, and it's
'Ndrangheta is Calabria.
The Calabrian mafia, that's it. Like my friend over there just corrected me. There we go. The Calabrian mafia is very present in Central Europe, and especially deals with the exporting of cocaine from Colombia to Central Europe. And that's a very lucrative business. So the type of mafia that you will run into if you will, mostly in Europe, and that you could see in Poland. I'm not sure if they are in Poland or not, but they're definitely in Germany. Is this mafia here? So the stereotypes are quite true, but I feel that the American movies, if you know the Godfather was actually filmed under the supervision of the New York mob. And because they didn't want the movie to give a negative impression of them, so they focused on the romantic aspects. And I think that the actuality of it is a lot harsher and a lot more barbaric than they want to make it look. So it's a bit of a damaging stereotype, if you will, but it is mostly true. It's just that the kind of the violent aspects of it are de-emphasized, and this type of kind of idea, I think they really would like to be seen as sort of noble family with honor and other stuff like that.
Yeah, you could say like as any government would do.
Now we're getting into the libertarian stuff. Oh man, like we will never stop this conversation.
Yeah, government is just official mafia, right? I think I've heard a story that in World War II, when the Americans and actually also Polish soldiers, which fought there, invaded Italy from the south to like topple over the fascist regime. Yeah, that apparently they just made deals with local mafia because they had the structures of local government. So
that doesn't sound crazy to me. I can't confirm or deny, but it sounds reasonable knowing what I know.
Yeah. So, I mean, just if you know any mafia in the world, is the Italian mafia. And then maybe Yakuza is the second world, the best known mafia in the world, but Italians for sure are the first.
I'm not sure about ranking them, but I might be overemphasizing the importance of the Italian mafia just because of the closeness to my culture.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned the mama boy stereotype.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Like most Italians stay with their moms until they're 30. Mom, I don't know how, but we're both a patriarchal and matriarchal society at the same time. I leave the discussion of that to the sociologists, but mothers are a very big part of the household. It's a very, very important part, mothers and grandmothers. And also there's this kind of expectation that, like in a lot of European countries, parents try to push their children out of the house to kind of get them to become their own thing. But the Italians have this kind of forever umbilical cord that never gets cut. It is unhealthy. I believe it's pretty unhealthy. But the weird thing is that the stereotype, the macho that goes around and approaches women and blah blah, is the same guy that then goes back to his mother, and then like those are the same person.
Yeah, I've seen. I mean, okay, Family Guy is not the best place to learn about other nations because it's the stereotype ground zero.
Yeah,
but I think of a macho guy, I think of Family Guy, and it's like, yeah, he would whistle. He would whistle, and then second later he'd be like, "Mama, like, I apologize."
Yeah,
very much.
Yes, those are 100% the same person.
Any other, I don't know, maybe archetypes, because this wouldn't be a stereotype, right? So archetypes of Italian characters you think are not well known, but could be fun to use in role-playing games. And lastly, any other any stuff about Italy that you think isn't known but you would like to share?
I actually think the paladin stories that I referenced at the beginning, they really do deserve, like they're a native type of fantasy that are actually underappreciated in Italy as well. So we're talking about the works of Ariosto and Boiardo. And these two poem writers, they wrote these poems about like the paladins serving Charlemagne and getting involved into like romantic relationships with women and all sorts of weird shit, and it's all very Italian, like it's almost and they have a lot of stock characters in there. Like Rodomonte is a very popular character who's like kind of a smart ass, gets into danger, swashbuckling hero. I think those stories, I don't know if there's translations of them. There definitely probably is. They deserve reading, and they would be very, very fun to play in a role-playing setting, I feel. So this type of kind of band of paladins that are going on some sort of mission for the king, and then they get involved with love and other weird stuff like rivalries, enemies, and the fantastical powers are involved. But it's very different from this type of English Tolkien-esque fantasy. So it's difficult to describe if you haven't read it. But I would recommend.
Before I forget, I have to ask you, because Warhammer, Tilea, are you familiar with it?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with most of Warhammer lore. I'm really sorry.
Okay, because Warhammer just like Tilea, which is like totally not Italy, in the same way that the Empire is totally not the Holy Roman Empire, and Estalia is totally not Spain, so there's Tilea, which is, I don't know this lore very much, but I think it's just, basically it's Italian Renaissance city-states with a lot of politics and backstabbing and poison.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, okay, so
sounds about right. I mean, you should. Yeah, another thing that I consider people should read is Machiavelli's The Prince. He goes really in depth with the politics of the time of the Renaissance, and also how he feels a ruler should be, which is controversial. It was controversial at the time and is controversial now, which is essentially be manipulative because that's the only way you can win. Type of stuff. So I think that there's a lot of cool things that can come if you're familiar with those aspects and you want to run some political game. I think the Italian Renaissance is a perfect setting for something like that. like, no, you're my brother's sister or something. The brothers are incesting and they have a secret child, but the child became the Pope, so now we can't. Yeah, something like this. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, if you were to run a game with those themes in Poland, like the default setting would be Italian. So
I don't see any problem with that. It sounds pretty realistic.
Italian Renaissance specifically, yes.
Yes, that sounds pretty right.
Okay. Yes. Also, I recall the Assassin's Creed games, the second one and the sequels. Yeah,
they are the Assassin's Creed 2 and Ezio Auditore are very loved in Italy. Okay. They are, I feel, a very good representation of culture, if a bit stereotyped.
Of course. Okay, yeah, but it's a representation that you're proud of, like.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah, okay. Italians generally, I would say, I like it, and most Italians like it as well.
Okay, makes sense. So back to Italian things that you think maybe should be known more, or could be known more, and it would be cool.
The Paladin stories. I think the Betrothed is an excellent novel. It's like, I think if you like Tolkien, then that is also something you would like. It's a bit of a historical novel, so it's not very fantastical, but I think it has some of the similar themes that The Lord of the Rings has. And I think it's generally excellent. Like, Italians are usually forced to read it in school, so they end up hating it. But I think it's an excellent novel. And also there's a crime writer called Sicilian crime writer called the Camilleri. He writes these books in a bit of a made-up language that is halfway between Sicilian and Italian. It's kind of like when the Americans do Spanish speaking by dropping random Spanish words in an English sentence. He does the same thing. And they're very interesting crime novels because it's all based on more like the internal psychology of the detective and how he reacts to the things he discovers. And it's less about kind of solving the crime as a puzzle. I think those stories are excellent. They've also been adapted to TV. And I do believe that the BBC has aired them with subtitles. So they should be able to be found with subtitles to be watched on the internet. I don't know if legally it's possible, or translations of the books. I think those are rather excellent. I think they would also make for very good role-playing content. And the detective is called Montalbano. He's called Commissioner Montalbano. I like those books very much, and I think that more people outside of Italy should be reading them.
Okay, I see his mugshot on the. Oh, he looks tense.
Yeah. The actor is pretty well regarded. He's a bald guy, I think. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I see. Okay, and of course Don Matteo.
Yes, Don Matteo. Yeah, we need to do the Brindlewood Bay hack of Don Matteo now.
I'll mention it to my friend. So I doubt he'll have the time, but if you take the idea and do it. We might do a Polish version. I mean, it's even like same format, different culture. It's good enough for two separate games. So
yeah, fair enough.
It will work. Okay, that's it from me.
Yeah, that's it. I think for me as well.
Thanks for the conversation. We've been talking for 3 hours.
Yeah, I know, it was very fun. I'm sorry if I went into some kind of deep parentheses that are not exactly coherent with the theme that you wanted to say, but
easy. Like I have a philosophy of like conversation first. So like the conversation, awesome. I'm interesting first, and then hopefully. So depending on how I edit this, you, dear listener, might have. I don't know how long it is. The shorter it is compared to 3 hours, the more extra stuff there is just for patrons. Speaking of which, I invite people to like and subscribe to like promote this channel. We're gonna for sure continue the series of tabletop RPGs in different countries. And I'll invite you to visit Polish channels if you speak Polish, or if you just want to watch Polish people speak Polish. I don't know, maybe in a few years, the AI will translate all the stuff in the internet anyway, so...
Well, I know a single sentence of Polish, which is baza wirusów została zaktualizowana.
Nice. Do you use Avast?
Yeah, I mean, every country has that meme, right? So
Okay. I see. Yeah, it's like the Avast antivirus software.
yeah, when you're playing Warcraft 3 and the audio message comes up.
Yes.
So I just wanted to say I run a forum where we are very, very happy to have international guests, and there's a policy on like how to interact with the Italian speakers. So if you're interested in interacting with us or sharing experiences, it's called La Locanda dei GDR, which means the RPG Inn. And maybe you can leave a link on the YouTube video or something.
For
and,
sure, I will have
if
a link in
anybody's
the description. So
is interested, it's an eclectic forum that tries to cover all play styles. So it's not like a insular community. And we're very happy to get international visitors. And if there's any need of assistance with interacting with the Italian speakers, I'll usually do it.
nice. So again, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, the listener, for listening. And I leave any comments you want, whether you were angry about something we said, whether you think that Italian culture wasn't fully represented. I mean, I don't know, 3,000 years of culture, I think 2 hours was enough.
Yeah, I definitely represent the entirety of Italy and not just my experience.
Yeah, so give us a note in the comments if we like missed any topic or perspective, and we'll see. The series is open to doing the same country again, so keep that in mind. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Maciej.